He is one of the most feared men in all of Asia. 19 years of building an empire soaked in silence, blood, and billions. But every single night, this ruthless mafia boss reaches beneath his shirt and holds a worn gold locket, the only thing left of a little girl who once saved his life. Now, standing in a crowded Seoul conference hall, he hears her voice again. And the most dangerous man in Korea cannot breathe. Stay with me until the very end of this story. If it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The locket was never clean. 19 years of body heat had darkened the gold to something closer to bronze, worn smooth along the edges where his thumb had traced the same path 10,000 times. Kang Min-jae kept it beneath every tailored suit he had ever owned, beneath the Italian wool, beneath the bulletproof vest he wore during 3 separate assassination attempts, beneath every layer of the man he had built himself into. He never once left it in a drawer. He never once put it in a safe. Some things you do not trust to steal. On the morning of the summit, he stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the presidential suite on the 41st floor of the Hangang Meridian Hotel and watched Seoul wake up below him. The city spread in every direction, gray and vast and lit by a sky the color of cold ash. It was early November. The Han River was dark. Delivery trucks moved along the expressway like slow beetles, and somewhere down in Yeongdeungpo, he knew, 2 of his men were already positioned outside the conference center checking sightlines and memorizing faces. He touched the locket through his shirt. His phone had already produced 14 messages before 7 in the morning, 3 from his chief of operations regarding a logistics disruption at the Incheon terminal, 2 from his legal team about a municipal zoning challenge to his new development in Mapo-gu, 1 from a man named Park Do-hyun, who ran the Northern Territories under Min-jae's protection, reporting that a rival faction from Busan had begun moving product through Nowon without permission or tribute. The remaining messages he did not read. He already knew what they contained because men who controlled as much as he did received the same categories of problems on rotation, and he had learned long ago that urgency is mostly theater performed by people who cannot solve things themselves. He was 27 years old when he took over the Consolidated Syndicate. He was now 35. 8 years of holding something that large together will change the architecture of a man's face. His reflection in the glass showed him that fact plainly. The jaw had sharpened. The eyes had gone still in the way eyes go still when they have watched too many things they cannot unwatch. There was a scar along his left jawline from a bottle broken across his face in a room in Itaewon during a negotiation that went wrong before he had learned that negotiation is war conducted at a table, and war requires the same preparation. He had learned. He did not carry that lesson gently. He buttoned his jacket. He did not eat breakfast. He had not eaten breakfast before a significant day since he was 8 years old, and breakfast was not guaranteed. The International Humanitarian Leadership Summit was not the kind of event Kang Min-jae would ordinarily attend. He attended business forums, trade conferences, private investment gatherings in Zurich and Singapore and Abu Dhabi. Environments where the language of money provided sufficient cover for a man whose full biography could not survive public scrutiny. But the summit served a specific strategic purpose. His tech subsidiary, a legitimate artificial intelligence company registered in Seoul under the name Novasight Corporation, had been quietly positioning itself as a partner to several international humanitarian organizations through facial recognition systems adapted for missing persons databases. The partnership was real. The humanitarian application was real. The fact that the same underlying system had been running a different search for 19 years was known to exactly 3 people on Earth, and 2 of them worked for him. He stepped away from the window. His security lead, a broad-shouldered former military intelligence officer named Cho Jung-won, was waiting in the hallway with 2 additional men. Cho had worked for Min-jae for 6 years and had long since stopped attempting to make small talk in the morning. He simply fell into position, and they moved. In the elevator, Min-jae looked at nothing. He was already thinking about the session agenda he had reviewed the night before. Panel discussions, keynote addresses, a breakout session on technology partnerships in vulnerable population tracking, and 1 presentation, 3rd on the afternoon program, a slot most attendees would regard as the dead zone before the closing reception. from a representative of an American nonprofit called the Bridge Initiative, based in Los Angeles. The presenter was listed as a senior field director. He had read the brief biography twice. African American, 30 years old, formerly a military family dependent, had lived in multiple international postings before completing graduate work in social work at UCLA. Had spent the past 6 years building field programs for abandoned children and displaced military families across 3 continents. He had read it twice because something in the description had made his pulse behave strangely. He told himself it was nothing. He had told himself that before. The conference center was already crowded when they arrived. Min-jae moved through the lobby with the particular quality of stillness that powerful men develop. Not the stillness of passivity, but the stillness of a man who has simply decided that the space around him is his, and the decision was made so long ago that it no longer requires maintenance. People adjusted to him without knowing why. Conversations paused and resumed. A woman in a red blazer started toward him with an outstretched lanyard, and then thought better of it when Cho materialized at his left shoulder. He collected his credentials without stopping. The morning sessions were exactly what he had anticipated. A Norwegian minister of development spoke for 40 minutes about systemic displacement. A panel of 4 academics discussed data ethics in humanitarian technology in a language calibrated to impress each other. A former UN coordinator presented statistics that Min-jae had already read in cleaner form in private briefings. He sat in the back of the main hall and absorbed it all with the flat attention of a man performing patience. During the midday break, he took a call from Park Do-hyun and resolved the No-won situation in under 4 minutes. The resolution was not pleasant for the faction from Busan. It was final. He returned his phone to his jacket pocket. He ate nothing. He thought about the locket. He had been thinking about it more than usual in the past 3 weeks, which he recognized as a pattern he had never successfully explained to himself. Sometimes months would pass, and the locket was simply a weight he carried, familiar as bone. Then something would shift. A smell, a quality of light, the sound of a child speaking at a certain pitch, and the weight would change character, become sharp instead of familiar, and his mind would move back to a winter alley in Seodaemun-gu and the particular cold of that afternoon and the sight of his own hands, small and cracked and trembling, against dirty concrete. He had been 9 years old. He had corrected the story to 8 in his own mind for so long that he no longer knew which was true, and it did not matter. What mattered was the cold. What mattered was that everyone walked past, everyone except one person. He had survived many things that should have finished him. The trafficking network that had held him for 2 years before he escaped. The streets afterward, which were in some ways worse because the danger was shapeless. The winter that nearly did kill him, the winter she found him. The years after she left, when the cold came back in different forms. The man who took him in, a gray-haired mafia patriarch named Baek Sung-hwan, who saw something in a starving boy that Min-jae himself could not yet see, and the education that followed, which was nothing like school and everything like survival raised to an institutional form. He had survived Baek's death and the power vacuum it created, and the 2 years of violence that preceded his consolidation of the syndicates. He had survived all of it. He was not sure he would survive hearing her voice again, if it was actually her voice. He was not sure that was an irrational fear. The afternoon sessions began at 2 o'clock. Min-jae took his seat in the main hall earlier than necessary. He was aware of this. He told himself it was because the room would be crowded and he preferred a clear sightline to the exits, which was true, and had nothing to do with the fact that he had positioned himself in line with a 3rd presentation slot. The first presenter was a Kenyan logistics coordinator who spoke with extraordinary precision about supply chain failures and disaster relief. Min-jae listened and found it genuinely interesting, which surprised him slightly. The second presenter was a Korean tech entrepreneur whose work overlapped with Nova sites in predictable ways, and Min-jae spent most of that presentation watching the side door through which presenters entered. Then the moderator's voice came through the speakers. He introduced her by name. Min-jae did not move. He heard heels on the stage. He heard the adjustment of the microphone. He heard the soft clearing of a throat. And then he heard a voice, and the voice went into him like a key into a lock that had been waiting for 19 years. I want to start by telling you about a kid nobody could see. Her voice was lower than he remembered. Of course it was. She had been 10 years old. He had been whatever age he was, starving and freezing and half delirious in a January alley, and her voice had been the first warm thing that reached him before the food did, before the coat, before any of it. Her voice speaking to him in words he didn't understand yet, with a tone that required no translation. He had learned English because of her. He had learned it the way a man learns the language of the country that saved his life, which is to say, completely, and with a quality of attention he had never given anything else. He turned his head very slowly toward the stage. She was standing at the podium in a dark green blazer, her hair pulled back, a slight nervous movement in her left hand that she controlled after a moment. She was 30 years old. She was not the 10-year-old girl he had constructed from memory and preserved in amber. She was someone different, someone who had grown through time the way people grow. Not linearly, not cleanly, but with evidence of difficulty and choice visible in the set of her shoulders, in the way she held the microphone like she had stood at enough podiums to stop being afraid of them, but not quite enough to fully trust them. She was, without question, the most compelling person in the room. Min-jae's hand had moved to his chest before he was aware of it. His fingers found the locket through the wool of his jacket. Cho Jung-won, seated one chair to his right, noticed the gesture and noticed the quality of stillness that had come over his employer, and kept his face neutral with the professional discipline of a man who understood that some things were not his to read. She spoke for 22 minutes. Min-jae would later be unable to account for most of the content. He knew she discussed invisible children, the ones who fall between the categories that relief organizations track, the military dependents who move too often to build support networks, the kids who present as functional when the adults around them are looking for the obvious fractures, and so nobody finds the less obvious ones. She talked about what it means to be seen by exactly one person at the right moment, and how that single act of recognition can determine the entire downstream shape of a life. He knew those words were not aimed at him. He felt them land on him like something physical anyway. When she finished, the applause was genuine and unhurried, the kind that comes from a room that wasn't expecting to be moved and found itself moved. She gathered her notes. She smiled briefly at the moderator. She walked off the stage through the side door. Min-jae stood. Cho was immediately at his elbow. "Sir?" "The cafe on the east corridor." Min-jae's voice was level. "Find out if she's going to the reception." "I'll check." "Don't ask anyone directly. Check the coordinator's list." Cho moved. Min-jae stood still in the emptying row of seats and looked at his own hands for a moment. They were not small and cracked and trembling. They were a man's hands, clean, controlled, carrying a particular economy of movement that had been trained into them over years of learning how to hold things, weapons, contracts, the attention of dangerous men, without giving anything away. He had held the locket in these hands 10,000 times. He walked toward the east corridor. She was standing near the window at the far end, a coffee cup held in both hands, speaking with a younger woman who appeared to be her colleague. The afternoon light was coming through the glass at a low November angle, and it caught the side of her face in a way that stopped him 3 steps into the corridor. He made himself continue walking. He stopped at a distance that was close enough to be purposeful, but far enough to be technically coincidental. He was very good at the architecture of coincidence. He had used it in rooms far more dangerous than this one. Her colleague noticed him first. People always noticed Min-jae first when he was trying not to be noticed, which was its own kind of irony. The colleague's eyes went slightly wide. She knew his public face, or something approximating it, which was the face of a Korean tech billionaire and philanthropist who appeared in business publications and occasionally in society pages, never in the coverage he actually warranted. Amara Brooks looked up. He watched her see him as a stranger. He watched her register handsome, powerful, deliberate. He watched her construct the category of man she was looking at and settle into polite professional readiness. She had no idea. There was no recognition in her eyes, and he had known there wouldn't be. He had been a gaunt, hollow-eyed, filthy child the last time she had seen him, and he was now a man who had remade himself so completely that sometimes he could not locate the child inside him without help. He had carried her help in a locket for 19 years. His hand went to his chest. His fingers found the clasp through the wool. He pulled the chain over his head in one motion. Something he had never done in the presence of another person, something he had not fully planned to do in this moment. And he held the locket out in his palm between them. The light caught the worn gold. Amara's eyes dropped to his hand. He watched the coffee cup tilt, very slightly, in her grip. He watched her breathe change. He watched her look up at his face again, and this time she was not looking at a stranger. She was looking at his face the way you look at a room you have been away from for 19 years, searching for the furniture that used to be there, finding the shape of it under everything new. That's... Her voice caught. She stopped. Min-jae said nothing. He let the locket do what 19 years of searching had led to this moment to do. Her colleague had gone very still. Amara set the coffee cup on the nearest surface without looking at it. She reached out and her fingers touched the edge of the locket, not taking it, just touching, the way you touch something you aren't sure is real yet. Her eyes were bright with something she was working hard to keep contained. "Where did you get this?" Min-jae looked at her steadily. The question landed in his chest like something he had been holding his breath for. He had prepared for many versions of this moment across many years. He had never prepared for the sound of his own answer, because every version he had rehearsed felt wrong before it left his mouth. What came out was the truth, which is the only thing that ever actually fits. "A girl gave it to me," he said quietly, "in a winter alley in Seodamun-gu. I was starving. She brought me food every afternoon for 3 weeks until her family had to leave. She said it had belonged to her mother. She said she wanted me to keep it until she could come back." Amara's hand had stopped moving. Every drop of color had drained from her face and come flooding back in the space of 3 seconds. "She made me practice the English words for it," he continued, and his voice was doing something he had not given it permission to do, something raw at the edges that Cho Jung-won, standing 20 feet away at the corridor entrance, had never once heard from this man in 6 years. "Promise me you'll eat." That was the first sentence I learned. The colleague stepped back. Amara did not notice. Her eyes had gone to the locket, and then to his jaw, and then to his eyes. And Min-jae watched her find what she was looking for. Not in his face exactly, but behind it, the shape of the boy inside the man, the thing that time cannot fully bury no matter how much is built on top of it. "Min-jae," she said. Not a question. The sound of his name in her voice, in the voice he had been hearing in the back of his mind for 19 years, hit him with a physical force that he was not prepared for and could not have been prepared for, because some things do not yield to preparation. He said, "Yes," and Amara Brooks pressed both hands over her mouth and stood there in the pale November light of the East Corridor, with tears moving down her face and everything she had thought she understood about the shape of her own story rearranging itself around a worn gold locket and a name she had never quite been able to forget. Min-jae stood absolutely still. His hand was trembling. For the first time in 19 years, he let it. What neither of them knew yet, what would not surface until the coffee went cold and the corridor emptied and they sat together until the reception ended without attending it, talking in the hushed, urgent rhythm of two people making up for lost years, was that Min-jae's search had triggered something. 3 weeks earlier, Novasite's facial recognition sweep had flagged not just Amara, it had flagged someone watching her. The report was sitting in an encrypted file on Cho Jung-won's phone. Cho had not yet shown it to his employer because his employer had looked, for the first time in 6 years, like a man who needed 60 more seconds of peace before the next problem arrived. The 60 seconds were almost up. The report on Cho Jung-won's phone contained 4 photographs. The first was a street-level image pulled from a public traffic camera 3 blocks from Amara's apartment building in Los Angeles, time-stamped 11 days before the Seoul summit. A man in a gray jacket stood at the corner with his back half turned, the posture of someone waiting without wanting to look like he was waiting. Novasite's system had flagged him not for his face, which was angled away, but for a tattoo visible above his collar. A specific mark that Min-jae's database cross-referenced against known affiliates of a criminal organization called Samshin Block, a Busan origin network that had been attempting to expand its operational footprint into international territory for the better part of 2 years. The second photograph was the same man, different angle, same street, 4 days later. The third was a close-up enhancement, grainy at the edges, showing the tattoo clearly. The fourth was from the summit's own lobby security feed, time-stamped that morning at 9:47 a.m. The man in the gray jacket was inside the building. He had credentials. He had a lanyard. He had a name tag that Cho's team had already cross-referenced against the attendee list and found to be registered under a consulting firm that did not exist at the address listed. Cho stood at the entrance of the East Corridor and watched his employer sit across from a woman he had never seen before and speak with a quietness that did not belong to the version of Kang Min-jae that Cho knew professionally. He waited. He gave it another 4 minutes. Then he walked across the corridor and stopped at the table and set his phone face down on the surface between them. Min-jae looked at it, then he looked at Cho. "Now?" Min-jae said. "I'd have shown you earlier." Cho's voice was flat, uninflected. "You were in the session." "Show me." Amara watched the shift happen. It was not dramatic. It was more unsettling than dramatic. The man across from her, who had been speaking with a rawness she had not expected from someone who looked the way he looked and carried himself the way he carried himself, simply became someone else. Not a different person. The same person, but a door had closed somewhere behind his eyes, and the room on the other side of it was one she did not have access to. His face did not harden exactly. It reorganized. She watched it happen in under 2 seconds. He picked up the phone. He looked at the 4 photographs without expression. He set it down. "When did the flag come through?" 3 weeks ago. I sat on it until I could verify the summit credentials independently. And the no-on situation this morning? Related, possibly. The Busan faction. Do-hyun thinks they're testing multiple pressure points simultaneously. Min-jae said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at Amara. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't categorize. Not fear, not confusion exactly, something more like a person standing at the edge of a room they were not sure they should enter, reading the walls. "I need 5 minutes," he said. "Take them," she said. "I mean, I need you to stay at this table." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going anywhere, Min-jae." The way she said his name again did something to the inside of his chest that he did not have time to examine. He stood. He gestured to Cho, and they moved to the far end of the corridor, close enough to the window that their reflections stood in the darkening glass beside them. "How confident are you on the Samshin identification?" 90%. The tattoo placement is consistent with the northern chapter. The consulting firm registration is a shell. I had Hyun-soo run it against the business registry this afternoon. Nothing there older than 8 months. He's in the building. He was in the building. I've had 2 of our people walking the floor since 11. He attended the morning sessions and left during the lunch break. He hasn't come back through the main entrance. Service entrance? Possible. We don't have coverage there. Min-jae looked at his own reflection in the glass. He looked like what he was, which was a man who had just had 19 years of searching arrive at their conclusion and was now required within the same hour to assess a threat profile against someone he had spent 19 years looking for. The convergence was almost elegant in its cruelty. He had spent enough time in rooms where cruelty operated to recognize it working, even when it wore the face of coincidence. "Puller Security Details Contact," he said. "The American nonprofit. They'll have a liaison with the Summit Security Coordinator. I want to know what her movements look like for the next 48 hours. Cho looked at him for one measured beat. "You want me to secure someone you met 45 minutes ago?" "I want you to secure someone I've been looking for 19 years, Min-jae said. "The 45 minutes is irrelevant." Cho did not argue. He pulled out his phone and walked toward the lobby. Min-jae stood at the window for another moment. Outside, Seoul was moving through its evening. Lights coming on in the towers across the river, traffic building on the expressway. The city proceeding with its enormous indifference to the specific weight of any individual moment occurring within it. He had loved this city and resented it and feared it and eventually claimed it, and it had never once cared about any of those transactions. He went back to the table. Amara was still there. She had not touched her coffee. She was watching him approach with the same expression, the one at the edge of the room. And when he sat down, she did not ask him what that had been about, which told him something about her that he filed away carefully. "You were about to tell me about the foundation," he said. "You were about to tell me about the search." She tilted her head slightly. "That man who just walked away. He works for you." "Yes." "He works for you the way someone works for a CEO, or he works for you some other way?" Min-jae looked at her. He had rehearsed versions of this conversation across many years. In the abstract, the way you rehearse conversations you believe will eventually become necessary. Every version had felt insufficient. He had concluded, somewhere around year 12 of searching, that there was no version of this conversation that would not cost him something. "Both," he said. She absorbed that without flinching. "How other?" "That's a longer conversation than this corridor allows." "Then we should find somewhere that does." He studied her face. She was not performing calm. She was actually calm, or close enough to it that the difference was academic. She had the steadiness of someone who had spent years working in conditions where panic was a liability, where reading a room fast and clearly was a survival skill, even if the survival in question was bureaucratic rather than physical. She had gone into difficult rooms for a living. She was in one now, and she knew it, and she was still sitting across from him asking for the longer conversation. "There's a restaurant 2 blocks from here," he said. "Private dining room. I use it when I'm in Seoul." "Of course you do," she said, and the edge in it was dry and not quite hostile, and he found he had missed that specific quality of response from another human being, someone who would push back at him without calculating the cost first. They left the corridor together. The restaurant was called Seorin and occupied the 3rd floor of a converted textile building on a side street off Toge-ro. The private room in the back had no windows to the street, which Min-jae had always appreciated for reasons that tonight felt newly complicated. He sat across from her at a table built for 6, the space between them crossed by candlelight and the particular silence of a room that has been designed to hold things that cannot be said in public. He told her about the syndicate. He did not begin with the criminal infrastructure. He began with Baek Sung-wan, because that was where the truth actually began. The old man who had come into the alley behind the shelter in Mapo 2 years after Amara left, not the same alley but the same category of alley, and found Min-jae not freezing this time but fighting, badly, against 2 older boys over a bag of food, and who had watched long enough to see that the younger boy would not stop even when he was losing badly. Beck had not rescued him. He had offered him an opportunity, which was something different and more honest. "He told me I had 2 options," Min-jae said. "Stay on the street and survive another year or 2 at the rate I was going, or come with him and learn how to survive indefinitely." He said indefinitely was better. And the cost of indefinitely. Loyalty, absolute and unconditional, to him first, and to the organization he was building. An organization that ran illegal operations. Yes. He looked at her directly. Gambling, protection, some trafficking in contraband. In the beginning, I did not understand the full scope. By the time I did, I was 12 years old, and I had nowhere else to go, and I had already seen enough of what the streets did to children who had nowhere to go. Amar's hands were flat on the table. Trafficking. Not of people. He held her gaze. Baek had hard limits. He was not a good man, but he had limits, and one of them was that. When I was 17, I found evidence that 2 of his lieutenants had begun operating a side network against his explicit prohibition. I brought it to him. He dealt with it. He paused. I also dealt with it, which was the first time I understood what it meant to do something that cannot be undone. The candle between them moved in some small current of air neither of them had caused. "And now?" she said. "Now I run operations across 5 sectors. 3 are entirely legitimate: technology, real estate development, logistics infrastructure. 2 are not. The protection network operates across 4 cities. There is a financial channel that processes money for people whose money cannot be processed through standard systems." He watched her face. "I'm telling you this because you asked, and because you have the right to know exactly what you're sitting across from." She said, "Have you hurt people?" Not a question, a line drawn, and a request to locate himself relative to it. "Yes," he said, "killed. Not directly. I have ordered things that resulted in deaths. I have done this more than once." He did not look away. "The first time I was 22. A man who was organizing an attack against Beck's household, which included 3 staff members and one of Beck's grandchildren. I had 3 days of warning and one option. I took it. Amara was quiet for a long time. Outside, through the floor's ambient sound system, something faint and stringed moved through the room and disappeared. "The child trafficking rings," she said finally. "The ones you dismantled. That's documented. I looked you up after the summit listed Novasite as a partner organization. That documentation reflects real work. I'm not questioning it. I'm trying to locate the edges of you." She picked up her water glass and put it down without drinking. "You built a facial recognition system. You told me it was for humanitarian purposes, finding missing people. It is. And you used it to find me." He held very still. "Yes." "How long has it been running that search?" 7 years, since I had the technical capability to build it." She exhaled. The sound was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, and it carried something complicated in it. "You have been tracking me for 7 years." The system flagged publicly available images, social media, professional listings, conference registrations, nothing invasive. "Min Jae," she said it flat. "You built an AI surveillance system and ran it on me for 7 years. That is the definition of invasive." He had no defense for that. He did not offer one. "Yes," he said again. She stood up and walked to the far wall and stood there with her back to him for a moment. He did not follow. He had learned, across years of managing dangerous men in enclosed spaces, when to move and when to let stillness do the work. She turned around. "The girl I gave that locket to was 8 years old and starving," she said. "I've thought about him. You, probably once a week for 19 years. I worried about whether you survived. I worried about it specifically, like a thing that had weight. I used to think about it when I was working with kids on the street because it made the work feel less abstract." She pressed her fingers against the edge of the table. "And now I'm sitting in a private dining room in Seoul being told that you are a mafia boss who has been running facial recognition on me since you had the technology to do it. I know how that lands." "No," she said, "you don't. Because the person I imagined you becoming didn't have the power to track me across continents without my knowledge. The person I imagined had to hope." Something in that sentence hit him in a place he had not been prepared to defend. "I did hope," he said quietly. "The system was how I did it. Some people light candles. I built software." She stared at him. Something moved through her expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the early architecture of it, which is understanding whether the person in front of you understands what they've actually done. "Tell me about the trafficking networks," she said. "The ones you went after." He told her. He told her about the first operation, 4 years into his control of the syndicate, when Novasite's missing persons work had led his team to a commercial network running out of a shipping facility in Pyeongtaek. He told her what they found and what they did, and what the official authorities, tipped anonymously, found when they arrived. He told her about the second and the third. He told her about the ways in which operating from inside the criminal world had given him access and leverage that no legitimate organization possessed, and the ways in which that leverage came with costs he paid in the currency of things he could not put on a public balance sheet. He told her all of it. She listened the way she had listened on stage, with her full attention, without performing reactions, without inserting herself until she had the full shape of what she was working with. By the time he finished, it was past 10 o'clock. The restaurant had gone quiet around them. "The locket," she said. He reached into his shirt and held it out to her across the table. She took it this time, fully, cupped it in her palm. She turned it over. She pressed the small clasp and it opened, and there was nothing inside. It had been empty when she gave it to him. The original photograph lost to the streets before Beck found him, but the inside surface still showed the faint impression where a photograph had once been adhered. Her thumb moved over the impression. "My mother's picture was in here," she said. "I know. I'm sorry. She died when I was 7. My dad kept moving us around because he didn't know what else to do with grief. We were in Seoul for 8 months. She closed the locket. She held it for another moment, then placed it carefully on the table between them, not giving it back, not keeping it, setting it in the neutral space. I'm not going to tell you this is simple. I know. You're describing a life that I can't just, it's not a thing I can just absorb in one dinner and come to a conclusion about. I know that too. But I also, she stopped. She started again. I've spent my entire career working with kids who needed someone to see them. And the reason I do that work, the actual originating reason, the thing that pointed me at this instead of something else, is you. A boy in a winter alley who looked at me like I had handed him the whole world when all I did was bring food. Min-jae said nothing. So I'm not walking out of here, she said. I'm also not agreeing to anything. I'm saying I want to understand it, all of it, the real shape of it, not the version you'd tell a journalist or a court. She met his eyes. The actual shape. That will take more than one dinner. Then we'd better start scheduling. His phone vibrated on the table. Then again. Then a third time in rapid succession, which was Cho's emergency pattern. 3 pulses, 30 seconds apart, that meant something had moved from assessment to incident. Min-jae looked at the phone. Then he looked at Amara. I need to take this, he said, standing. Go. He stepped outside the private room and put the phone to his ear, and Cho's voice came through low and fast. The man from the lobby, the Samshin affiliate with the non-existent consulting firm, had been picked up on a camera 2 blocks from the restaurant 12 minutes ago, and he was not alone, and one of Min-jae's men following them had just reported they had stopped moving, which, in Cho's professional estimation, meant they were waiting for something, and the something they were waiting for was almost certainly Min-jae to exit the building. Min-jae stood very still in the narrow hallway outside the private room. He thought about Amara Brooks on the other side of that door. He thought about a worn gold locket on a table between them. He thought about the Samshin block's pattern of operations, which he knew in detail, which told him that this was not a hit. It was a message. The kind of message that involves a specific form of collateral damage designed to communicate that the sender knows what you value and is prepared to touch it. His hand was not trembling now. He went back into the room. She looked up. We need to leave, he said, and we need to leave right now, and I need you to trust me for the next 20 minutes without a full explanation, and I promise you will have the full explanation the moment we're somewhere safe. She read his face for exactly 2 seconds. She stood up, picked up her bag, and said, Which door? And that was the moment. Not the locket, not the East Corridor, not the 19 years, but this. A woman who had just learned the full shape of who he was, choosing to move with him through a door into whatever was waiting on the other side. They went out through the kitchen. Cho had already moved the car to the service alley behind the building. A black SUV with plates registered to a shell company that had no visible connection to Min-jae's public profile. One of his men was at the kitchen door when they came through, and the cook and the single prep worker still on shift looked up and then looked back down at what they were doing, which was the correct response, and told Min-jae that Cho had spoken to the restaurant's manager before they ever sat down for dinner. Amara did not ask about any of this. She moved through the kitchen at his pace, close but not touching, and he registered that she had the physical intelligence of someone who had done field work in difficult environments. She did not crowd him, did not drift, kept herself in his sightline without being told to. The alley was cold. November in Seoul carries a specific cold that comes off the river and settles into the narrow spaces between buildings and stays there, and Min-jae felt it hit the back of his neck as they came through the door. Cho was at the SUV, driver's side rear door already open. The second man, Yoon, was at the alley entrance watching the street. Yoon held up 2 fingers without turning around. 2 men still positioned outside, still waiting. Min-jae put his hand lightly on Amara's arm, not gripping, just directing, and she moved to the car and got in without being asked. He followed. Cho was already in the front passenger seat. The driver, a compact man named Shin, who had been with the organization for 11 years, pulled out of the alley before the door was fully closed. They drove in silence for 40 seconds. Where are we going? Amara said, not frightened, asking for information. Safe house in Yongsan, 20 minutes, and the men outside the restaurant. Being managed. She turned and looked at him directly. By managed, you mean? I mean, Yoon and two others will follow them at distance and determine whether they move or wait. If they move, we'll know which direction they're operating from. If they wait, we'll know their surveillance rather than active, which gives us more time. More time for what? To understand what they want and whether it's specifically about you or specifically about me or both. She absorbed that. She looked out the window. The city moved past in streaks of orange and white. Both, she said quietly, mostly to herself. Probably, he said. She turned back to him. You said the Samshin block. I don't know what that is. A criminal organization based in Busan. They've been attempting to expand northward for 2 years. I've blocked 3 of those attempts through legitimate business competition, acquiring logistics contracts they were positioned for, buying out a real estate corridor they needed for distribution. They've responded through proxy operations. The Noan situation this morning was another probe. And me. You are leverage they didn't know they had until 3 weeks ago, which means someone told them. He said that last part evenly, but something behind his eyes had gone very cold, and Amara heard the temperature of it even though his voice stayed level. Someone told them I was looking for you, and why, and they decided to use that information. Someone inside your organization. Yes. She let that sit between them for a moment. Outside, the Han River appeared briefly between buildings, black and wide and indifferent. How many people knew about the search, she said. 3, myself, Cho. He paused. And the head of Nova Site's internal research division, a man named Lee Chanho. Cho, in the front seat, did not turn around, but his shoulders moved, a small, controlled adjustment that meant he had already arrived at the same place. You trust him, Amara said. I trusted him, Min-jae said. Past tense is doing significant work in that sentence right now. They drove the rest of the way in silence. The safe house in Yongsan was a 6th-floor apartment in a building that presented as ordinary residential, middle-income families, a convenience store on the ground floor, a dry cleaner next door. The apartment itself was 3 rooms, clean, functional, stocked with provisions and communication equipment, and nothing that would look out of place to anyone who did not know what they were looking at and could not find the floor safe beneath the kitchen tiles. Amara sat at the kitchen table. Cho set a glass of water in front of her, and she drank half of it immediately, and Min-jae registered that as the first involuntary thing she had done all evening, the thirst she'd been suppressing while managing everything else. He sat across from her. I need to make calls, he said. Make them. They'll be in Korean. I know what Korean sounds like, she said. Make your calls. He made 4 calls in the next 30 minutes. The first was to his operations chief, a woman named Ha-soo Yeon, who ran the legitimate side of his business empire with terrifying efficiency and who handled crisis information with the same affect she brought to quarterly earnings, flat, precise, without editorializing. He told her to pull Lee Chanho's system access retroactively, covering the past 6 months, and have a full report on his communication patterns on Min-jae's encrypted server within 2 hours. The second call was to a contact inside the National Police Agency, a deputy commissioner who had a long and carefully maintained relationship with Min-jae's legitimate business interests and who understood, without anything being stated explicitly, that certain pieces of information moved in both directions between them. Min-jae gave him the fake consulting firm name and the tattoo description and the lobby security timestamp and asked for any known Samshin block movements through Seoul in the past 30 days. The third call was to Park Do-yoon in the Northern Territories, brief and specific. Freeze all contact with Busan-adjacent networks. Report anything unusual in the next 12 hours directly to Cho. The fourth call was to a number he had not dialed in 8 months. It rang 7 times before a voice answered, graveled and slow, belonging to a man named Baek Jun-seo, the only surviving son of Baek Sung-hwan, who had no role in the organization but who maintained through old loyalties and older information a kind of passive intelligence about the criminal landscape that had proven useful in the past. The Samshin block, Min-jae said without preamble. What's their current leadership situation? A pause. The sound of something being set down on a hard surface. Why are you asking me instead of your own people? Because I want a source outside my own structure. Another pause. Longer. There was a leadership change 8 months ago. The old chairman died. His nephew took over, young, aggressive, wants to make a statement. Name. Samshin calls him Chairman Guk. Real name is Guk Taeyang. 31 years old. Spent 3 years in Macau learning from a Hong Kong network. Came back with ambitions and no patience. What does he want besides the northern expansion? Reputation. He wants to be the person who made Kang Min-jae bleed. Baek Junseo's voice carried something that might have been pity and might have been warning and was probably both. He's not interested in a business negotiation. He's interested in a public accounting. Min-jae ended the call. He sat with that for a moment. Amara was watching him from across the table. She had not pretended not to follow the emotional tenor of the conversations, even without understanding the language. Bad, she said. Complicated, he said. Tell me the difference. He told her about Guk Taeyang. He gave her the relevant outline. Young chairman, point to prove. Not interested in the kind of equilibrium that criminal organizations eventually reach when they've been operating long enough to understand that sustained conflict is expensive. Guk wanted a moment, wanted to demonstrate to whatever audience he was performing for that the man who controlled Seoul's consolidated syndicate was not untouchable. And I'm the moment, she said. He did not answer immediately, which was its own answer. Min-jae. You are leverage, he said. The distinction matters. They're not targeting you because of who you are. They're targeting the fact that I've been looking for you for 19 years, which tells them that you are the thing I have not been willing to use for operational purposes. The thing you actually care about. Yes. She pressed her fingers flat against the table surface. And Lee Chan-ho, your research director. I don't have confirmation yet. But you think it's him. He is the only person outside of this room who knew the full scope of the search. Cho has been with me for 6 years and has had dozens of opportunities to sell information more valuable than this. He glanced at Cho, who was standing at the window with his back to them. Lee has been with me for 4 years. He came from an academic background, AI research, Seoul National University. I brought him in specifically for Nova Site, and he turned. If the analysis confirms it, yes. Why would he? Min-jae looked at the table. Money is the obvious answer. Fear is the other one. If Samshin approached him and he believed refusing would put him at risk, he might have given them what they wanted to buy himself safety. He paused. Or he might have gone to them voluntarily. I won't know which until I speak with him. Amara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What happens when you speak with him? The question had a specific gravity to it. She was not asking procedurally. She was asking what kind of man was sitting across from her and whether the answer she'd been constructing all evening was going to hold. That depends on what he tells me, Min-jae said, and if he sold you out voluntarily. He met her eyes. Then the conversation will be very short and the consequences will be significant, and I will not lie to you about what those consequences look like. She held his gaze for a long time. Her jaw was set. She was working through something. Okay, she said finally. Okay. I'm not okay with it, she clarified. I'm acknowledging that I'm in a situation where I don't have the leverage to change the terms right now, and pretending otherwise would be stupid. She picked up the water glass. I've spent 6 years doing field work in places where the formal systems failed completely, and the only protection available came from sources I wouldn't have chosen in a different world. I know what it looks like when the imperfect option is the only option. He said nothing. That doesn't mean I'm not going to have opinions about it later, she said. I would expect nothing less. The encrypted laptop on the kitchen counter produced a soft alert at 12:41 a.m. Min-jae opened it. Hasuyan's report had arrived 40 minutes ahead of schedule, which told him she had started pulling the data the moment he ended the call, rather than waiting for full compilation. She was efficient in ways that sometimes felt like a rebuke. He read the report. He read it twice. Then he sat very still for approximately 10 seconds, which Cho, who had turned from the window, read immediately, because in 6 years he had never once seen Min-jae sit still for 10 seconds after receiving information, unless the information was severe. Sir, Min-jae turned the laptop to face across the table. The report showed Lee Chan-ho's communication records for the past 6 months, internal system access, flagged anomalies, and, most critically, 3 data exports from Novasite's secure server, each one covering a different portion of the search parameters for Amara Brooks. The exports had been routed through a proxy that was, on examination, not particularly sophisticated, which meant either Lee was not skilled at covering tracks, or he had not expected anyone to look. The timestamps on the export showed the first one occurring 4 months ago, the second, 6 weeks ago, the third, 3 weeks ago. The same week, the Samshin affiliate appeared on a traffic camera outside Amara's apartment in Los Angeles. Min-jae's eyes moved to the bottom of the report. Ha-soo-yeon had added a single line of annotation beneath the export records. She was not a person who editorialized. The annotation read, "Cross-referenced Lee Chan-ho's personal financial records via the banking access we maintain. Deposit of 40 million won to a secondary account 8 weeks ago. Source unverifiable through standard channels." 40 million won. Min-jae closed the laptop. The number sat in his chest like a coal. Not because it was large. It was not large by the standards of what he moved in a week, but because Lee Chan-ho had been inside Novasite for 4 years. He had sat in meetings with Min-jae. He had been trusted with the one search that mattered more than every operational objective Min-jae had constructed across a decade. And he had sold it for 40 million won, which was less than what Min-jae paid in a quarterly bonus to his logistics coordinator. He had been sold for less than he was worth. That was almost funny. He stood up. He told Cho to bring the car around. He told Amara he needed to leave for a period of time, and that 2 of his men would remain in the apartment and that he would be back before morning. She stood up when he did. "Where are you going?" "To find Lee Chan-ho. At 1 in the morning. He lives in Mapogu. He'll be home." She stepped around the table. She was not trying to block him. She put herself in his sight line and kept her voice even. "And when you find him, I'll ask him questions first. And then?" He looked at her. The coal in his chest was doing something to the edges of his voice that he could feel but could not fully control. "And then I'll make a decision based on what he tells me." "Min-jae." She said his name the same way she'd said it in the East Corridor, not as a question, as an anchor. "Look at me." He looked at her. "Whatever you do tonight," she said, "you're going to have to live with tomorrow. And so am I, if I'm going to be in this." The words landed cleanly. He held them. "I'm not asking you to be soft," she continued. "I'm asking you to be precise. There's a difference." He nodded once. He did not promise anything specific, but he held the distinction she had drawn and put it somewhere he could reach it. He left. Lee Chan-ho lived in a 6th-floor apartment in a residential complex near Hapjeong Station. Min-jae arrived there at 1:17 a.m. with Cho and Yoon. The lobby security camera had been looped by Cho's technical man 30 minutes earlier. They took the elevator. Min-jae knocked on the door. A light came on inside. Footsteps. A pause at the door. The man checking through the peephole. Then nothing, which was wrong because an innocent man opens the door when his employer knocks at 1 in the morning because an innocent man assumes it's an emergency. A guilty man stands frozen on the other side of the door doing math. "Chan-ho," Min-jae said quietly. "Open the door." Another pause. The door opened. Lee Chan-ho was 41 years old, thin-faced, wearing the look of a man whose body had already known for weeks that this moment was coming and had simply been waiting for the rest of him to catch up. He was in a gray t-shirt and sweatpants. His hair was pushed up on one side from the pillow. His eyes, however, were not the eyes of a man pulled from sleep. They were fully awake. They had been awake for a while. "Sir," he said. Min-jae walked past him into the apartment. Cho stayed in the doorway. Yoon stayed in the hall. The apartment was small and orderly, books along one wall, AI texts, research journals, a few Korean literary novels, a laptop open on the coffee table, screensaver running, a coffee mug that was still faintly warm when Min-jae passed the back of his hand near it. He turned around. Lee Chan-ho was standing near the door, hands at his sides. "Sit down," Min-jae said. He sat. Min-jae remained standing. He did not raise his voice. He had learned, across many years, that the absence of volume in a confrontation was more destabilizing than its presence, because it removes the target's ability to calibrate how much danger they're in based on acoustic evidence. "Tell me about the exports," he said. Lee Chan-ho's hands pressed flat against his knees. A small movement, involuntary. "I don't know what—" 3 exports from the secure server, your credentials, 4 months ago, 6 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, each one covering a separate portion of the Amara Brooks search file. Min-jae's voice was absolutely level. "Tell me about them." The silence in the room lasted 6 seconds. Min-jae counted. Then Lee Chan-ho's shoulders dropped. Not dramatically, just a small release, the kind that happens when a man decides that the performance of innocence is more exhausting than whatever comes next. "They approached me 7 months ago," he said. "Who made the approach?" "A man I didn't know. He knew my name, my position, my salary. He knew about a debt I had, a private debt, a bad investment, nothing to do with the organization." He stopped. He pressed his hands harder against his knees. "He told me they only needed one piece of information, where the search was directed, who you were looking for. And you gave it to them." "Not immediately, but eventually." Lee looked up. His eyes were red at the rims, and Min-jae could not tell if it was sleeplessness or something else, and found he did not particularly care which. "I gave them the first export 4 months ago," Lee said. "Just the name. Just who she was, where she worked. I thought that would be enough, that they'd stop asking." "They didn't stop asking. They came back. They wanted the location tracking, the movement data. They said if I didn't give it to them, they would—" He stopped again. "They would what?" Lee closed his eyes briefly. "My sister lives in Incheon. She's 34. She has 2 kids. They knew her address. They knew her children's school schedule." Min-jae looked at him. He thought about Amara in the East Corridor, touching the locket with one finger as if checking whether it was real. He thought about 40 million won in a secondary account. "The money," he said. Lee's eyes came back up. Something complicated moved through them. "They deposited it. I didn't ask for it. I didn't want it. I haven't touched it." "That's not exculpatory." "I know." "You endangered someone," Min-jae said, and the coal in his chest had shifted now, become something harder and more specific. "Who has spent her entire adult life working to protect vulnerable people. You gave a violent organization everything they needed to use her as a weapon against me. And you did this while working inside a company whose stated purpose is finding people who are lost." The last sentence came out quieter than the rest, which meant it was the most dangerous sentence in the room, and Lee Chan-ho heard that and went very still. "I'm sorry," he said. It came out thin. It was not enough, and they both knew it, and he knew they both knew it. Min-jae looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to Cho and said quietly, "Take him somewhere safe. Not a cell. A room. He doesn't leave until I say otherwise. And no one speaks to him except you." Cho moved. Lee stood up, understanding that safe was a relative term, and that relative terms were, given the alternative, the best he was likely to receive tonight. Min-jae walked to the window. Below, Hapjeong's late streets were nearly empty. A convenience store on the corner threw a rectangle of yellow light across the pavement. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. The message was from a number he did not recognize. 4 words and an image file. The 4 words were, "We have what you love." The image was a photograph taken through a long lens, slightly blurred at the edges from the distance, showing the exterior of the safe house building in Yongsan. And in the photograph, standing at the 6th floor window, the window where Cho had stood earlier, the window Cho had moved away from when he came to look at the laptop, was Amara Brooks, looking out at the street below, visible and lit and entirely unaware that someone in the dark was looking back at her with a camera. Min-jae's blood went cold in a way it had not gone cold in years. He was already moving toward the door when his phone rang. Not Cho's line, not any number in his contacts. And the voice on the other end was young and unhurried and carried the particular confidence of a man who had just laid all his cards face up on the table because he was certain his hand was stronger. "Kang Min-jae," the voice said, "I think it's time we had a real conversation. But first, I need you to understand something clearly." A pause, brief and theatrical. The girl at the window has no idea that the two men your security team left in that apartment are both currently unconscious on the kitchen floor. Min-jae did not answer the voice on the phone. He put the phone in his jacket pocket without ending the call, letting the line stay open, letting Guk Taeyang speak into dead air. And he went through Lee Chan-ho's apartment door at a pace that Cho, following immediately, had to accelerate to match. "The safe house," Min-jae said. "Now." They were in the car in 40 seconds. Shin pulled out before the door closed. Min-jae pulled the phone back out and put it to his ear. Guk Taeyang was still talking. The young chairman had a voice that liked the sound of itself. Smooth, measured, performing patience the way young men perform patience when they want to sound older than they are. He was in the middle of a sentence about leverage and mutual understanding and the natural order of territorial business. Min-jae interrupted him. "If she's hurt," he said, and his voice had gone to a place that had no temperature in it at all, "there is no version of the next 72 hours where you come out of this with anything. Not the northern expansion, not your reputation, not the thing you're trying to build." He paused. "I want you to hear clearly that this is not a threat. It is a logistical description of what happens next." A brief silence on the other end. Then Guk said, "She's not hurt. We're not animals." "Where is she?" "That depends on you." "Name the terms." "Face to face, you, me. No Cho Jung-won, no security detail. A location I choose." Another pause, this one performative. "And you sign the Northern Corridor transfer documents before you walk in the room. The Mapo-gyu development. The Incheon logistics contracts. Everything your lawyers have been blocking for 18 months. Min-jae looked out the window. They were crossing the river. The water below was black and flat and moving. "And in exchange," he said, "she walks, unharmed, undocumented, returned to the Summit Hotel within the hour. You have my word." "Your word," Min-jae said. "I know what you think of it, but I'm a businessman, not a butcher. Hurting an American humanitarian worker creates a category of problem I don't need." Guk's voice had settled into something that sounded almost reasonable, which was the most dangerous register a man could use in a negotiation. "I need the territory. You need the woman. This is simple math. Give me an hour. You have 30 minutes. After that, I start making phone calls to people who are very interested in the personal history of Korea's most powerful syndicate boss and the American woman he's been hunting with facial recognition software for 7 years." The line went dead. Min-jae lowered the phone. Cho was watching him from the front seat. "Terms," he said. "He wants the corridor transfer. In exchange for her release. Face to face, my security outside." Cho's jaw tightened. "No." "I know. If you walk into a room alone with Guk Taeyang after signing over the northern contracts, you walk out with nothing. The contracts don't compel him to release her. He gets what he wants, and then the leverage remains." "I know that too. So we're not doing that." "We're not doing that," Min-jae agreed. "We're doing something else." He looked at Cho. "Call Do-hyun. Tell him I need every available man in Central Seoul in the next 25 minutes. Tell him to pull from the protection network. I don't care which territories go uncovered tonight." "How many?" "As many as Do-hyun can move in 25 minutes. Cho was already on his second phone. Min-jae looked back out at the river and thought about Amara standing at the window of the safe house, not knowing that the two men Cho had left in the apartment were unconscious on the kitchen floor. He thought about what she had looked like standing at the edge of the private dining room. Not afraid, reading the room. He thought about what she had said before he left. Be precise. There's a difference. He was going to be very precise. His own phone rang. The number was one he recognized, Yoon, his man who had been on the street outside the restaurant earlier. "Talk," Min-jae said. "I followed the two Samshin men from the restaurant." Yoon's voice was low and slightly compressed, the acoustic quality of someone speaking while moving. They drove to a commercial building in Yeouido. 14-story office tower, currently undergoing partial renovation on floors 9 through 12. The upper floors are dark. "I've been watching the building for 40 minutes. I've counted 4 additional men entering through the service entrance." "Floors. I can't confirm, but there's intermittent light movement on 11. Are you sure it's the same building? The car they used is in the parking structure. I ran the plate, registered to a shell company out of Busan. Same registration pattern as the consulting firm from the summit. Min-jae looked at Cho. Yoido, he said. Office tower. 11th floor. Cho relayed it to Do-hyun on the other line without breaking stride. Shin was already adjusting direction. The building was a 30-year-old commercial tower on Yoido's western edge, the kind of structure that had been impressive once and was now in the long middle passage of institutional decline. The lobby marble yellowed, the elevator panels worn to silver at the button edges, a renovation project that had been running for 8 months and would probably run for 8 more. At 11:45 on a November night, the street in front of it was empty. A food delivery bike was locked to a post at the corner. A convenience store across the intersection through its usual yellow rectangle. Shin parked 2 blocks east. They walked. Yoon materialized from a doorway as they approached. He was a lean man who moved quietly and had a face that people forgot immediately after seeing it, which had always made him useful. He fell into step beside them. 4 confirmed entry points, he said. Lobby is locked. Renovation crew long gone. Service entrance on the south side is the active door. I've seen 3 people use it in the last hour. All going in, none coming out. There's a secondary stairwell access at the north end. Steel door, probably not alarmed given the renovation status. Inside layout, Min-jae said. I pulled the building's permit filing from the city database 20 minutes ago. Yoon held up his phone, a floor plan photographed from a screen. 11th floor is mid-renovation. Open plan on the east half, 3 walled offices remaining on the west. Center section has a temporary partition. He pointed. If they're holding her somewhere controlled, it's one of the 3 offices. Min-jae studied the plan for 6 seconds. How many men from Do-hyun? Cho checked his phone. 14. First group arrives in 11 minutes. Second group in 19. I'm not waiting 19 minutes. Then we wait 11. They waited in a doorway on the south side of the building. Min-jae stood with his back to the wall and his eyes on the service entrance, and did not look at his watch because looking at a watch does not make time move and only demonstrates to the people around you that you are afraid, which he was, in the specific way that fear operates in men who have trained themselves to act regardless, not the absence of fear, but its compression into something usable. He thought about the phone call. Guk Tae-young's 30 minutes were running down. The young chairman was waiting for a callback that was not coming, and at some point in the next several minutes he would realize the callback was not coming and he would have to make a decision about what that meant. And the decision he made would tell Min-jae exactly what kind of man Guk Tae-young actually was beneath the reasonable voice and the business language. A man who panics under silence makes mistakes. Min-jae intended to be the silence. Do-hyun's first group arrived in 12 minutes rather than 11. 8 men in 2 vehicles, parking on opposite ends of the block. They were not the kind of men who looked like what they were, which was the point. They looked like the kind of men who are out late on a Tuesday in November for reasons that are plausible and forgettable. They moved to positions without instruction because Cho had given the positions to Do-hyun on the phone and Do-hyun had briefed them in the car. This was the infrastructure of a consolidated organization operating at the level it had been built to operate at. And for a moment, standing in the doorway watching it deploy, Min-jae felt the full strange weight of what he had built and what it cost to build it, and why the cost had always felt, on some level, worth it. He pushed that away. Later. North stairwell, he said. They went in through the steel door at the north end. It was not alarmed. The stairwell smelled of concrete dust and the particular cold of a building that has been opened and opened again over months of renovation. The lights were off. Cho had a flashlight, which he kept low and pointed at the steps. They climbed in single file. Min-jae, Cho, Yoon, and 2 more of Do-hyun's men who had come in through the south service entrance simultaneously on Cho's signal and were now 1 floor below moving up through the main stairwell. At the 10th floor landing, Cho stopped them with one hand. Above, through the door to the 11th floor, voices. Min-jae could not make out words. 2 voices, maybe 3. the acoustics of the stairwell compressing and distorting. One of them was elevated, not shouting, but pushed past conversational, the register of a man who has received news he did not want and is managing his reaction badly. Guk Taeyang had figured out that the callback was not coming. Min-jae put his hand on the stairwell door handle. Cho put his hand on Min-jae's arm. 1 second of eye contact. Min-jae nodded. Yes, I know. Yes, I'm controlled. Yes. And Cho removed his hand. Min-jae opened the door. The 11th floor was exactly what the permit diagram had shown. Open-gutted east half, temporary partition down the center, 3 offices on the west side with their doors visible from the stairwell entrance. The floor was raw concrete, the ceiling stripped to ductwork and conduit, the ambient light coming from 2 work lamps on standing poles that threw sharp yellow circles and left the rest in hard shadow. There were 6 men visible from the stairwell door. 2 were near the partition. 2 were outside the center office door. 1 was at the window with a phone to his ear. The 6th was Guk Taeyang himself. Min-jae identified him immediately. Younger than expected, compact, wearing a coat that was too good for this environment, standing in the center of the open space with the posture of a man who had arranged something and was watching it fail to go according to plan. The center office door. Min-jae's eyes went there and stayed there. Cho's hand moved. Behind them, in the stairwell, the 2 men from Do-hyun's group received the count via signal and held position. Min-jae walked out onto the floor. It took 3 seconds for anyone to see him. The first man who did was the one at the window, who pulled the phone from his ear and said something sharp. And all 5 of the others turned, and Guk Taeyang's face went through a sequence of expressions. Surprise, recalculation, and then, settling beneath both of those, something that tried to be authority and did not quite make it. You came alone, Guk said. I came to end this tonight, Min-jae said. He kept walking. He stopped 8 feet from Guk. He did not look at the other 5 men. Looking at the other 5 men would be a concession to their relevance, and they were not relevant yet. Open the office door. The terms are not what you think they are anymore. Min-jae's voice was as flat and cold as the concrete under his feet. You have approximately 90 seconds before 14 men I brought with me finish taking positions around this floor, at which point your situation changes in ways that will be difficult to reverse. I'm giving you this window right now to make a choice that preserves something for you. Guk's jaw tightened. He was 31 years old and he had planned this as a statement, and the statement was not landing the way he had written it. Min-jae could see him recalculating at speed, which was both necessary and slightly dangerous, because young men who recalculate fast sometimes make the wrong calculation fast. You're bluffing, Guk said. Open the door, Min-jae said, and find out. 4 seconds of silence. Then Guk nodded once to the man nearest the office door. The man opened it. Amara was inside. She was sitting in a folding chair, wrists zip-tied in front of her, not behind, which registered immediately as a small mercy or a small signal, a chairman who wanted leverage rather than suffering. She was not physically harmed. Her blazer was off, folded on the floor beside the chair with the deliberate neatness of someone who controlled the things within her control when everything else was not. Her eyes came to the door, moved past the man who opened it, and found Min-jae. Her expression did not collapse into relief. It changed, but not into collapse. Something more precise than relief. The expression of a person who had been running internal calculations for an unknown period of time and had just received the data point that allowed her to finalize them. The zip ties, Min-jae said to the man at the door. The man looked at Guk. Guk looked at Min-jae. The northern corridor, Guk said. I need something. You're getting your life, Min-jae said. Tonight, that's the negotiation. From the south stairwell door behind Guk's position, Do-hyun's 2 men came through. From the north stairwell, Cho's additional men appeared. 6 of Do-hyun's group had come up through the service elevator on the east side and were now visible through the partition gap. They did not advance. They simply existed in the space, which was sufficient. Guk Taeyang turned in a slow half circle and looked at the geometry of the room and understood what it communicated. He was 31 years old, and he had come here to make a statement about power, and the room had just made a counterstatement that was considerably more specific. Cut the ties, he said quietly. The man at the door produced a knife and cut the zip ties. Amara stood. She picked up her blazer. She put it on. She walked to the door and through it and past the man who'd cut the ties without looking at him, crossed the 11 feet of raw concrete floor between the office and Min Jae, and stopped in front of him. She looked at his face carefully. You're not hurt. No. You're men in the apartment. Being dealt with. He studied her in the work lamplight. Her wrists were reddened where the ties had been. Nothing worse. Are you hurt? No. She held his gaze for one more second. We're going to have a very long conversation about this later. I know. Good. She turned slightly and looked at Guk Taeyang across the open floor. Guk was standing very still with the careful stillness of a man who has recently understood that stillness is in his best interest. She looked at him the way she had looked at Min Jae across the dinner table, with her full attention, without performance, reading the actual shape of something. He's young, she said quietly, to Min Jae only. Yes. Is he going to do this again? Minji considered. Not if the cost is clear. She nodded, something decided behind her eyes. Then she looked at Guk Taeyang directly and said, in a voice that carried across the floor without being raised, whatever you think you proved tonight, you didn't. Guk said nothing. I've worked with kids who ended up in organizations like yours, she continued. I know what it costs. I'm telling you that as a professional observation, not a lecture. She turned back to Min Jae. Let's go. They went down through the north stairwell, the same way they came up. Min Jae's hand at the small of her back through the dark descent, not guiding, just present. She did not pull away from it. In the car, Shin driving, Cho in the front with his second phone against his ear coordinating the withdrawal of Do-hyun's men, Amar sat beside Min Jae in the back and did not speak for the first 3 minutes. He did not push. He had learned the difference between silence that needs filling and silence that needs room. Then she said, How long was I in there? Approximately 2 hours from when I left the safe house. The men in the apartment. Your men. Sedated. They're being seen by a doctor now. They'll recover. She looked at her wrists. The redness was fading at the edges. He never threatened me directly. He told me there was a situation that needed to be resolved and that my presence was assurance. He was very polite about it. He wanted the Northern Territory contracts. He thought you were the cleanest path to them. Was he right? The question sat there between them, specific and necessary. Min Jae looked at it honestly. In a different version of tonight, yes. If he'd been more patient, if he'd timed it differently, if he'd applied pressure through channels I had less visibility into, possibly. He paused. He was not wrong about what you mean to me. He was wrong about my response to that. She turned to look at him. The city was moving past the windows again, the familiar catalog of light and motion, Seoul doing what it always did regardless of what happened in its 11th floors and its safe houses and its private dining rooms. What happens to him now? She said. Guk Taeyang. Yes. He understands that the statement he tried to make tonight failed publicly enough that his own network is aware of it. That's its own consequence. In his world, a failed move of that scale has structural implications for his authority. Min Jae kept his voice even. Beyond that, I'll communicate through the appropriate channels that the Northern Corridor is closed for the foreseeable future, and that future attempts to open it through personal leverage will be treated as a declaration of full hostilities rather than a negotiating position. And he'll accept that. Tonight taught him the cost of the alternative. Men that age learn best from things they can feel. He paused. Lee Chan-ho is a separate matter. She said nothing for a moment. Then, what are you going to do with him? Remove him from Nova's site entirely. Eliminate his access to every system. Ensure that the financial trail Ha Soo-yeon pulled is documented and preserved. Not for legal use, but so that he understands it exists and what it represents. He looked at her. He was coerced, at least initially. His sister and her children are genuinely not safe as long as Samshin can reach them. So the first thing I'll do is move them, quietly, with their cooperation if possible, to somewhere Samshin's network can't easily access. She absorbed that. You're protecting the family of the man who sold you out. I'm removing the leverage that was used to compromise him. Those are the same action. She looked at him for a long moment. The car moved. Outside, a late bus passed them going the other direction, lit from within and almost empty. The foundation, she said. The word arrived differently than he expected. He had mentioned the lighthouse foundation, the concept, the embryo of it, during their dinner, in the same breath as everything else. The way you mention something when you are trying to give someone the full inventory of who you are in a limited window of time. What about it? He said. You said you wanted to build something, with the resources from the legitimate side. Programs for abandoned children, housing, education. She kept her eyes on him. That's not a bribe. That's not you trying to make me comfortable with the rest of it. Tell me it's not. It's not. Tell me why. He was quiet for a moment. The Han River appeared again in the gap between buildings. The same river, the same darkness. And he looked at it and thought about how to say the true thing in the way it was actually true, rather than in the way it would land best. Because I was one of them, he said, an abandoned child in a city that had decided not to see me. And the one person who saw me, the one act of being seen, is the reason I'm sitting in this car instead of dead in an alley before my 10th birthday. He looked at her. I have built an empire on the back of that one act. I have billions of one that came from sources I cannot fully defend. If I can redirect enough of that into a structure that creates more acts like the one you performed for me in that alley, then the ledger is not balanced, that's not the right word, but it's moving in a direction I can look at. The car stopped at a light. In the silence of the stopped engine, Amara reached over and took his right hand in both of hers. She turned it palm up and looked at it. This hand that had signed contracts and held weapons and reached for a locket 10,000 times. She pressed her thumb into the center of his palm and held it there. He didn't move. I'll help you build it, she said, on conditions. Name them. You tell me everything, not after the fact, not managed versions, everything as it happens. If there's a situation like tonight, I know about it before it gets to the 11th floor of a building in Yoido. Yes. The legitimate transition, the shift away from the criminal operations, has a real timeline, not a vague intention, a timeline I can see and hold you to. That will take years. I know. Give me the timeline anyway. Yes. She looked at his palm for another moment. Then she released it. And the locket, she said. What about it? She reached into the pocket of her blazer and produced it. She had picked it up from the table at the restaurant, he realized, while he was outside on the call with Cho, because of course she had, because she was that kind of person, the kind who quietly secures the things that matter when other people are managing crises. She held it out to him. He looked at it. It's yours. It was my mother's, she said, and then it was yours. I think for now it belongs to what we're building. She pressed it into his hand and closed his fingers around it. So keep it. But keep it for a different reason than before. He held the locket in his closed fist. The light changed. Shin drove. Min-jae sat with the locket warm against his palm and felt, for the first time in 19 years, that the searching part was finished and something else, harder, more complicated, requiring more from him than searching had ever required, was just beginning. His phone buzzed. Ha Su Yeon. A message, 3 lines. He read it. Read it again. The blood in his face moved somewhere else. He looked up at Cho's eyes in the rearview mirror, and Cho, who had not seen the message, read Min-jae's expression and immediately reached for his own phone, because in 6 years he had learned that when Kang Min-jae's face did that specific thing, the situation had just produced one more layer that nobody had accounted for. The message from Ha Soo-yeon read, Lee Chan-ho's communication records show a 4th export we missed in the initial sweep, dated 6 weeks ago. It wasn't sent to a Samshin address. It was sent to a domestic law enforcement server registered to the Special Financial Crimes Unit. Someone inside the government has had your full profile, including the Amara Brooks search parameters, for 6 weeks, and they have not acted on it yet, which means they are not building a case. They are waiting for something. Min-jae read the message a 3rd time. The car was still moving. Seoul was still doing what Seoul did. and somewhere in a government building registered to the Special Financial Crimes Unit, a person who had possessed a detailed profile of Kang Min-jae for 6 weeks had chosen, deliberately, not to use it yet. Waiting for something. He showed the phone to Cho without a word. Cho read it. His face did not change, but his hand moved to his own phone and then stopped, because there was no call to make yet. They did not know who inside the Special Financial Crimes Unit had the file. And making calls against an unknown receiver was worse than making no calls at all. It told the receiver they had been identified before you were ready to act on that identification. Amara had felt the shift in the car. She did not ask. She waited. He showed her the message. She read it. She read it again. She handed the phone back without comment and looked out the window for a long moment, and when she looked back at him, her face had the expression he was already beginning to recognize. Not fear, not the performance of calm, but the actual thing underneath both of those, the face of a person doing precise and unsparing arithmetic. The government contact, she said, who would have access to that unit's servers. The Special Financial Crimes Unit operates under the Financial Intelligence Division. It's a small unit, 12 to 15 analysts, 2 deputy directors, 1 director. They handle organized crime financial networks. He paused. The deputy commissioner I called tonight about the Samshin block, his office is adjacent to that division. Could he have known? Min-jae thought about that call. The deputy commissioner's voice, unhurried, cooperative. The voice of a man performing the familiar choreography of their arrangement. Nothing in it had sounded like a man who was sitting on a 6-week-old file from the same investigation. But the deputy commissioner had been in his position for 11 years and had survived 4 administrations and 2 internal affairs reviews, which meant he was either clean or he was very good, and those 2 things were not always distinguishable from the outside. Possibly, Min-jae said. Or it could be someone else entirely. Yes. She pressed her fingers against the door handle, not to open it, just a place to put the tension. They're not building a case, which means they want something from you, something they can't get through an arrest. That's my read. Which means they'll make contact on their own timeline. She looked at him steadily. And when they do, you need to already know more than they think you know. He looked at her for a moment. You think like someone who has navigated institutional systems that weren't built to help her? I have, she said simply. For 6 years. They rode in silence the rest of the way to the Hangang Meridian Hotel, where Amara's summit accommodations were. The summit she had arrived at less than 18 hours ago as a nonprofit field director from Los Angeles, which now felt like a fact from a different geology of time. Shin pulled up to the entrance. The lobby was lit and nearly empty at this hour, a single attendant visible through the glass. Min-jae walked her to the entrance. She stopped at the door. I'm going to need a few days, she said. I know. Not away from this. In it. I need to think while I'm inside it, not while I'm retreating from it. She looked at him. I want to see Nova Site. I want to see the actual systems. I want to walk through what the foundation looks like in practice, not in concept. He had not expected that. He showed it briefly, which was unusual. You want a full audit. I want to understand what I'm agreeing to hold. She said it without apology. If I'm going to put my name and my work and my professional credibility into something built alongside what you've built, I need to see the actual structure, not the version you'd show a journalist or a donor. The actual shape, he said. Her own words from the restaurant. Yes. I'll arrange it. She held his eyes for one more moment. Then she did something unexpected. She reached up and pressed her palm briefly against the side of his face. Not a romantic gesture, something older than that. Something that said, I see you more clearly now than I did this morning, and I'm still here, which is the most honest thing one person can say to another after a night like this one. She went inside. He stood at the entrance until she crossed the lobby and the elevator doors closed behind her. Then he walked back to the car and said, Ha Soo-yeon's office. Now. Ha Soo-yeon was still in her office when they arrived, which did not surprise him. She was the kind of person who treated a crisis as an extended work session. She was 53 years old, had spent the first 15 years of her career as a forensic accountant for a major international firm, and had come to Min-jae's organization through a lateral move that she described to people outside as consulting, which was technically accurate and strategically incomplete. She wore reading glasses pushed up on her head and had the expression of someone who had been doing difficult arithmetic for several hours and was prepared to do more. She had 3 additional documents open on her screen when Min-jae sat down. "Walk me through the 4th export," he said. She walked him through it. The export had been smaller than the previous 3. Not the full search profile, but a specific subset. The Nova site facial recognition parameters, the search history timestamps, and a single document that Lee Chan-ho had attached, which was a summary memo he had apparently written for his own reference 6 months into the project, laying out in plain language what the search was for and why the organization's founder had commissioned it. A personal summary memo, not a system document, something Lee had created outside of the standard project files. "He wrote it for himself," Min-jae said. "That's my assessment," Ha Soo-yeon said. "The format is informal. No header, no project code. He probably wrote it to organize his own thinking about the project scope." She removed her glasses from her head and set them on the desk. "It's thorough. Anyone reading it would have a complete picture of the search's purpose, duration, and target. And this went to a Financial Intelligence Division server 6 weeks ago. The routing went through 2 proxy layers before I identified the endpoint. The second proxy was a commercial relay service used by several government agencies for secure document transfer." She paused. "Which means Lee Chan-ho knew the routing path to that server. He didn't stumble onto it. He has a contact inside the division. Or the Samshin approach to him was the second approach, and the first approach came from inside the government." Min-jae sat very still. He thought about the sequence. A government contact approaches Lee Chan-ho first, not Samshin, but someone inside the Financial Intelligence Division who wants a window into Novasite's internal projects. Lee, caught between institutional pressure and his employer, gives them the summary memo. Then Samshin finds Lee through their own channels, or is pointed toward him, and extracts the operational data about Amar's location. 2 separate buyers for different pieces of the same information, with Lee Chan-ho as the unwilling merchant at the center. "Who benefits from both the government and Samshin having that information," he said. Ha Soo-yeon looked at him over the desk with the specific expression of a forensic accountant who has already followed that thread. "Someone who wants you squeezed from both sides simultaneously. Someone who would benefit from either outcome. A criminal attack on your personal leverage, or a government investigation into your financial structure. A competitor. A competitor with access to both channels." She opened a 4th document. "I pulled the Financial Intelligence Division's published organizational chart. It's publicly available. The director has been in place for 3 years. He came from a background in commercial banking regulation. Before that, he was a compliance officer for a private financial group." She turned the screen slightly so he could see it. The financial group was Hansung Capital Partners, which, until 4 years ago, held a significant position in the Incheon logistics corridor before your acquisition effectively displaced them. Min-jae looked at the name on the screen. The director of the Financial Intelligence Division had spent 6 years at Hansung Capital Partners, and Hansung Capital Partners had lost the Incheon corridor when Min-jae's legitimate business interests outcompeted them for it, which had cost them an estimated 300 billion won in projected revenue and had contributed to the restructuring of their investment portfolio in ways that their board had not forgiven. The room was very quiet. "He's not building a case," Min-jae said slowly. "He has the file because he wanted it. But he hasn't moved because moving would expose his own connection to the acquisition. He can't use it through official channels without revealing that he directed a subordinate to solicit documents from inside a private company, which is its own legal problem. He's holding it," Ha Soo-yeon said, "as insurance, or as leverage for a private negotiation that he hasn't initiated yet. Because he's waiting for the right moment. Or the right pressure." She paused. "You disrupted Guktaeyang's operation tonight. That's going to be known in certain circles within 48 hours. If the director is watching, and I believe he is, he'll know that the Samshin angle failed, which means his insurance becomes his only remaining card. He'll make contact soon. Within a week, probably less." Min-jae sat with that for a long moment. Then he stood and looked at the organizational chart still displayed on Ha Soo-yeon's screen and memorized the director's name. Not that he would forget it, but the act of memorizing felt necessary, felt like the proper acknowledgement of what this man had done and what it was going to cost him. "Prepare a counterfile," he said. "Everything. The Hansung Capital connection, the server routing, the timeline of the document solicitation, the conflict of interest. I want it documented in a form that a journalist could read and understand in under 20 minutes." Hasuyeon nodded. She did not ask why a journalist. She understood the architecture of deterrence. "And Lee Chan-ho," Min-jae said. "He's in the room Cho arranged. In the morning, I want to speak with him again, with everything we now know. He deserves to understand that the government contact he thought was protecting him was using him as a tool in a private financial grievance." He paused. After that conversation, he resigns from Novasite, signs the non-disclosure documentation, and his sister and her children are relocated under our protection for the next 6 months. At 6 months, if the Samshin situation has been fully neutralized, the protection is lifted and the file is closed. Hasuyeon wrote it down. "And if he talks..." "He won't." Min-jae looked at her directly. "Because the counterfile will make clear that talking implicates him as deeply as anyone. He made choices. The choices have weight. But I'm not interested in destroying a man who is squeezed from 2 directions when I can use the energy more productively elsewhere." She looked at him over the desk with something that was not quite approval and not quite surprise. It was closer to the expression of someone updating a long-running assessment. "Elsewhere," she said. "The foundation," he said. "I need the legitimate transition to have a real structure. Timeline, accountability, documentation. Someone to hold it accountable from the outside." He picked up his jacket from the chair. "I'll need your help building that structure over the next several months." He left her office at 3:40 in the morning. The call from the director of the Financial Intelligence Division came 4 days later. It came to Min-jae's personal line, not the business line, not through Ha-Soo-yeon's office, which told him that the director had a source inside his private communications, which was a problem he filed for later. The voice was careful, measured, the voice of a bureaucrat who had spent years conducting conversations that were not conversations. "Mr. Kang," the director said, "I believe we have matters of mutual interest to discuss." "Director Lim," Min-jae said. He used the name without preamble, and the brief silence that followed told him the director had not expected to be named, which was the first point in a negotiation going to the person who arrives more prepared. "I see you've done your research," the director said. "I do thorough work," Min-jae said. "As I'm sure you know, given the document your office received from a Novasite employee 6 weeks ago." The silence this time was longer. "I want to propose a meeting," the director said finally. "I'm available Thursday," Min-jae said. "My attorney will be present. I'll also be bringing documentation that I think you'll want to review before we discuss terms. It relates to Hansung Capital Partners and your tenure there, and the question of whether your interest in Novasite's internal files constitutes a personal financial conflict of interest under the Government Ethics Act." He kept his voice even. "I'm not raising this as a threat, Director Lim. I'm raising it because I think both of us will have a more productive conversation if we both understand the full shape of the situation before we begin." Another silence, longer than the previous 2. "Thursday," the director said. "Thursday," Min-jae confirmed. He ended the call and sat at his desk and looked at his hands for a moment and thought about Ha-Soo-yeon's phrase, the full shape of the situation, and thought about how long it took to learn that information. Deployed precisely and honestly was almost always more powerful than force deployed loudly. Almost always. Thursday's meeting lasted 2 hours. Director Lim arrived with a deputy and a legal advisor and the careful energy of a man who had prepared for an adversarial exchange. He found instead a conference room in the Novasite building, a full and accurate accounting of the document solicitation timeline, presented by Ha-Soo-yeon in the flat, precise language of a forensic accountant, and a counter-proposal from Min-jae's legal team that was so cleanly structured that the deputy director spent 40 minutes reading it twice. The counter-proposal was simple. Director Lim would return all copies of the Novasite documents, document the return formally, and recuse himself from any financial investigations touching Min-jae's corporate holdings for the remainder of his tenure. In exchange, the Hansung Capital connection and the document solicitation would remain in a sealed file that Ha Soo-yeon would maintain, not destroyed, not filed with any external party, but existing in a form that both parties understood was real and retrievable. Neither side would walk away clean. Both sides would walk away functional. Director Lim signed the recusal form on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building he had not expected to leave on those terms. Min-jae watched him go and felt nothing dramatic about it. Just the low, dense satisfaction of a problem resolved at its root rather than its surface. He called Amara from the lobby. She answered on the second ring. She had spent the past 4 days doing what she said she would do, inside the work, not retreating from it. She had walked through Novasite with the system architect and asked questions that the architect told Min-jae afterward were the most technically precise questions he had fielded from a non-technical person in 4 years of running the division. She had reviewed the foundation's preliminary financial structure with Ha Soo-yeon. She had visited 3 sites in the Mapo and Dobong districts that Min-jae's organization had identified as potential locations for the first Lighthouse Foundation campus. She had not softened her conditions. She had made 2 of them more specific. "It's done," he said. A beat. The director. "Resolved. Ha Soo-yeon will brief you on the details. And it holds. The file holds. He's rational enough to understand the alternative." Min-jae moved through the lobby toward the entrance. "Are you still at the Mapo site?" "I'm on my way back. The second site is better. The building structure is worse, but the neighborhood access is better, and that matters more for what we're building." A pause. "The children need to be able to get there without crossing 4 arterials." He pushed through the lobby door into the afternoon. The November cold had moderated in the past week. Not warm, but less punishing, the kind of late autumn air that carries the memory of summer further than you'd expect. "I'll meet you at the office," he said. "Min-jae." "Yes. You did the right thing with Lee. His sister called me this morning." A pause. "She doesn't know who arranged the relocation. She thinks it was a non-profit housing program. I didn't correct her." He stood on the pavement outside the building and let the afternoon move around him for a moment. "How is she?" "Relieved, scared, grateful." Another pause, shorter. "Her kids are fine." He said nothing. "That matters," Amar said. "What you did. It matters that you did it that way instead of another way." "I know. I'm not praising you for it, I'm just noting it." The dry edge in her voice that he had come to recognize as the warmth underneath the precision. "See you in an hour." He pocketed the phone and walked to the car. The Lighthouse Foundation held its first board meeting on a Tuesday in February in a borrowed conference room in the Mapo district, 3 blocks from the site that would become its first campus. The board was 7 people. Amara as executive director, Ha Soo-yeon in a financial oversight role. 2 Korean child welfare professionals Min-jae's team had identified through rigorous vetting, 1 American international development specialist Amara brought from her network at the Bridge Initiative, and 2 community representatives from the Mapo district itself, a middle school principal and a woman who ran an informal resource center out of her apartment for families who had no other option. Min-jae attended as a board observer, not a member. His name was not on the founding documents. The foundation's public face was Amara's, her credentials, her professional history, her network. And this was not a concession or a strategy. It was an accurate reflection of what the foundation was. He had provided the resources. She was building the thing. He sat in the back of the room and watched her run the meeting and said nothing for 2 hours. She was extraordinary at it. She had the particular skill of someone who had spent years in rooms where the power dynamics were complicated and the stakes were real. She listened in a way that made people feel heard without mistaking being heard for agreement, and she moved the agenda forward without anyone noticing that she was moving it. And when the community representative from Mapo asked a pointed question about where the foundation's funding actually came from and what strings were attached to it, Amara answered it directly, completely, and without defensiveness, in a way that left the woman visibly reassured rather than managed. After the meeting, when the others had filtered out, she found him still in the back of the room, his jacket on, his hands resting on the table in front of him. "You didn't say anything," she said. "I didn't have anything to add." She sat down across from him. The room was empty now, the February light coming through the window at a low angle, the kind of winter light that makes everything it touches look permanent. "The alley," she said. He looked at her. "You told me in the restaurant that night that you wanted to take me back to it." She tilted her head slightly. "The alley in Seodamungu, where you were when I found you." He had not forgotten. He had not brought it up in the weeks since because the weeks had been dense with other necessities, and because some things, he had learned, should not be rushed toward. "Are you ready for that?" he said. "I've been ready since Thursday," she said. "I was waiting to see if you were." They went on a Saturday. The alley was 3 blocks from Seodamun Station, tucked behind what had been an international school and was now a private language institute occupying the same building. The neighborhood had changed around it in 19 years. New construction at the western end, a coffee shop where there had been a vacant lot, cleaner pavement. But the alley itself had not changed in any way that mattered. It was still narrow and still cold in February, and still the kind of place that people moved past without looking into. Min-jae stopped at the entrance. He had been here twice before in 19 years. Once when he was 22, a deliberate return to fix the geography of it in his adult memory rather than let it live only in a child's distorted recall, and once at 29, the year Novasite became technically capable of running the search he'd always intended. Both times he had stood here for a few minutes and left without naming what he felt because he did not have the language for it, and there had been no one to speak it to. Amara stood beside him. She did not take his hand. She looked at the alley the way she looked at everything, with her full attention, not filling it with what she expected to find. They walked in. The specific patch of concrete was against the left wall, near the old service door of the school building, now painted over in gray. He stopped there. He looked at the concrete. There was nothing to see. There never was, in places where the important thing happened entirely in the dimension of experience rather than the physical world. He reached into his shirt and held the locket. He had been holding it the same way for 19 years, and it still fit in his palm the same way, worn smooth in the same places, the clasp still slightly stiff. Amara watched him. He opened the locket. The empty interior, the faint impression where the photograph had been. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he held it out to her. "I've been carrying this," he said, "as a reminder of what I owed, what I was looking for, what I needed to become before I could come back." He looked at her steadily. "I don't want to carry it that way anymore." She looked at the locket in his palm. "What way do you want to carry it?" she said. He thought about how to say the true thing in the way it was actually true. "As something that belongs to what we're building, not to what I was looking for." He paused. "The same as you said, but I want to say it again because I mean it differently now than I did in the car." She took the locket from his palm. She turned it over the way she had in the safe house kitchen. The same careful handling of something that had weight beyond its physical weight. Then she pressed the clasp and opened it, and reached into her coat pocket and produced a small photograph, the size that fits in a locket, folded once. He looked at her. "It's my mother," she said. "I had it printed last week." She did not look at him while she said this. She was working the photograph into the interior of the locket, pressing it flat against the impression where the original had been. "I've been carrying her memory for 23 years. I think it's time she lived somewhere outside of just me." She closed the locket. She held it out between them. He took the chain in both hands and put it back over his head and tucked it beneath his shirt, and it settled against his sternum with the familiar weight that had accompanied every significant moment of his adult life. And he felt it differently than he ever had. Not lighter, that was not the right word, but less singular, less the weight of a solitary promise, and more the weight of something shared. They stood in the alley for a while. The February cold was around them, and the city was moving past the entrance to the alley the way it always moved, indifferent and enormous and continuous, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything, because the silence itself was not empty. Eventually, Amara said, "It's cold." "Yes." "There's a coffee shop at the end of the block." "I know. It wasn't there 19 years ago." She looked at him, the dry edge in her voice. "A lot of things weren't." They walked out of the alley together. The Lighthouse Foundation's first campus opened 11 months later, on a clear October afternoon in the building in Mapo that Amara had chosen for its neighborhood access. 340 square meters, a small courtyard where children could move freely, a resource library, 2 counseling rooms, staff who had been hired from the community rather than parachuted in from outside it. On the opening day, there were children everywhere. Min-jae stood at the edge of the courtyard in a coat that was not a tailored suit. He had started wearing different clothes on weekends, a small and unannounced shift that Ha Soo-yeon had noticed and said nothing about, and watched Amara move through the crowd of children with the ease of someone who had been doing this long enough that it no longer required effort, only attention. A boy about 7 years old, slight and serious-faced, detached from a group near the door and walked to the edge of the courtyard and stood there with his arms crossed and his eyes moving over the space with the expression of a child who is trying to determine whether a new place is safe before he commits to being present in it. Min-jae looked at him. He recognized the posture. He recognized the calculation behind the eyes. He had no memory of choosing to make that expression as a child. It was simply the expression his face had defaulted to in unfamiliar spaces, the automatic assessment of exit routes and threat levels that a child who has learned the hard way to trust no space until it proves trustworthy. He walked over to the edge of the courtyard and crouched down so he was at the boy's level. The boy looked at him, wary, taking him in. "Big place," Min-jae said, in the quiet voice he had learned to use in spaces where loudness was the wrong tool. The boy said nothing, but he uncrossed his arms. "There's food inside," Min-jae said, "near the window on the left. Tteokbokki. They made too much." The boy's eyes moved to the building, back to Min-jae. "Too much," the boy said, skeptical. "Way too much," Min-jae said. A long pause. The boy looked at the building again, then at Min-jae. Then he walked toward the door, not running, moving with the careful gait of a child who has learned not to want things too openly. Min-jae stood. Amara was beside him. He hadn't heard her approach. She was watching the boy move toward the door. "He reminds you of yourself," she said. "Yes." She didn't say anything for a moment. She watched the boy disappear through the door. "He'll be all right," she said. Not a prediction. Something more like a commitment. "Yes," Min-jae said, and he meant it the same way. They stood together in the courtyard while October light moved across it, and children filled the space that had been empty until someone decided it shouldn't be, and the locket against his sternum held the photograph of a woman he had never met, and the promise of the girl who had given it to him, and the weight of everything that one act of seeing, one person choosing not to walk past, had set in motion across 19 years and thousands of lives, and the long, complicated distance between a winter alley and this courtyard on a clear October afternoon. There was no clean ending to it. There never is, in lives that have been genuinely lived. But there was this. 2 people standing in the same space, having chosen each other with full knowledge of the cost, building something that would outlast the choosing. That was enough. That had always been enough.